and welcome to this roundtable discussion convened by the UN Secretary General to discuss rebirthing the global economy, putting sustainable development at its heart. I'm Misha Pillay. I shall be your moderator today, and we're going to get going with a short video to set the scene.
The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken the world. But what began as a health crisis has become an unprecedented global emergency, threatening lives and livelihoods across continents as economic slowdowns inflict heavy damage. The capacity of governments to respond is being severely tested, especially in lower-income countries. We need rapid assessments of how inequalities, systemic and structural deficiencies make some nations more vulnerable. The UN Secretary-General has said that through our combined, comprehensive and multilateral efforts, we can act to suppress the transmission of the disease and recover. But the world is also presented with a unique opportunity to emerge wiser and stronger based on Agenda 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within this decade.
This is the third economics roundtable convened by the Secretary-General to discuss and analyse the severe economic consequences of the pandemic and to put forward actionable recommendations on how to deliver sustainable development for all. The previous roundtables brought together two groups of women economists, the first very senior experienced economists, the second a younger group of economists. So they had different perspectives and different and diverse points of view on issues such as trade and debt and aid and external finance, climate action, of course, and jobs, always with a laser focus on sustainability and inclusion. And I'm sure that today's discussion will be equally dynamic. Shortly, we're going to be joined on the round table by an extremely eminent group of economists, including academics, practitioners, and thought leaders. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined today as well by Madame Christine Lagarde, the President of the European Central Bank, and also by the UN Deputy Secretary General, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed. First, though, let's get started. I'd like to invite the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, to make the opening remarks. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, but don't call me Excellency, because this is something that we have abolished in our meetings. There is even a fine of $1,000 each time the word Excellency is pronounced. Now, dear friends, dear Christine, dear Amina, welcome to this third roundtable on rebirthing the global economy to deliver sustainable development for all. Now, we launched these discussions to bring new ideas, fresh thinking, and different perspectives to the table. And over the past months, we have greatly benefited from the insights of distinguished women economists on debt, trade, finance, climate, and decent jobs. This is critical, as we face not only an unprecedented crisis, but also the opportunity to make real, foundational, and necessary change. Now, the challenges loom large. Much more than 1 million people have died from the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 100 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. Hunger has doubled. Famines loom. Inequalities are growing. Disruption to education is risking to create a lost generation, especially for children trapped on the wrong side of the digital divide. And the gender equality gap is widening. And women's labor force participation, a key driver for inclusive growth, has been set back decades. Now, as we face an urgent need for climate action and building a sustainable and circular economy, we need to do different. And let's recognize that developing countries in particular are on the precipice of financial ruin. So we need global solidarity and global coordination. Since day one, as you know, I've pushed for a massive rescue package equivalent at least to 10% of the global economy. Now, the truth is that developed countries have been able to do it by themselves with their own resources. But the same is not happening in support to the developing world. 2 days ago, again, at the G20 summit, I issued an SOS for the needs of developing countries. Of course, economic progress rests on halting the further spread of the pandemic. And so vaccines, tests, and treatments must be global public goods available and affordable for all. And this is now recognized. And I've been urging leaders to fully support and to fund the efforts. But we still have a gap in the COVAX facility, a gap of $28 billion US, and until the end of the year, a gap of $4.2 billion US in order to make indeed these new vaccines a global public good, a people's vaccine able to be affordable and available to all. And we also must mobilize the financing to build forward and to put economies on a sustainable path. As you know, in May, I convened together with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica that lead the group of friends for sustainable development financing. We gathered about 50 heads of state and government to focus exactly on financing for development in this era of the COVID-19 and beyond. And an array of concrete policy options has been put forward by 6 working groups that have worked for several months. And we need those proposals to be taken into account by decision makers. And we need a coordinated and multilateral response to provide the necessary liquidity and tackle the debt emergency in the developing countries. As a matter of fact, there has been a huge increase of liquidity in the world. But that liquidity has benefited developed countries. It has benefited middle-income countries with good access to financial markets that have good fundamentals. But for least developed countries and even other developing countries and some middle-income countries, that liquidity still is not enough. It has not really reached them sufficiently. And so we need to strengthen the firepower of the IMF and other international financial institutions to support the developing world. I've been asking for a new issuance of special drawing rights and reallocation of the unused SDRs, and also to broaden the eligibility of the G20 debt initiatives to make sure that they are able to achieve all vulnerable developing countries and even some middle-income countries that badly need it. Building a global architecture to enhance debt transparency and sustainability, as I proposed to the G20 back in April, is essential. And we need to align all recovery efforts with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on climate change. And we are having some problems. If one looks at the money that is being spent in recovery of the different economies, there is still more money being given to fossil fuel than to renewable energy, which means that we are still not exactly on track with what we usually say about a sustainable and inclusive recovery. But fortunately, there are also some good news. A growing number of countries have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050. China has done so before 2060. And I believe that in the beginning of next year, now with the change in the US administration, countries representing more than 65% of global emissions and more than 70% of the world economy may have commitments to carbon neutrality. And so it is the moment to have a quantum leap, to have a global coalition for net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and act now to integrate the goal of carbon neutrality into all economic and fiscal policies. And also to make sure that we create the conditions for every city, every region, every company, every bank, every country to have a plan, a transition plan for net zero in order to reach a global net zero in 2050 for our world as a basic condition to limit the temperature growth to 1.5 degrees in the end of the century. And of course, we need to implement also necessary measures in protection, in reskilling, for a just transition towards good and new green jobs. Everything has a cost, and the change to the green economy also has a cost. And we need to prove that we care for those that will be impacted by the move from the brown to the green economy, and that we have solutions also for them. And of course, we need to scale up investment in the care economy that also places value on the essential work that has become so clear in these past months. As you know, I've been pushing for a new social contract at national level, with a strong emphasis on education as the main equalizer, access to new digital economy, again, if properly done, as a central equalizer, and a new generation of social protection measures and also of measures related to fair labor markets. And we also need a new global deal at the international level. Power, resources, and opportunities must be better shared at the global level, and governance mechanisms must better reflect the realities of today. If you look at the Security Council of the United Nations, or even at the Bretton Woods institution, it is clear that participation and voting powers are still much more linked to what we were in the past than with the realities, geostrategic and economic realities of today's world. And at the same time, we need to integrate the principles of sustainable development into all decision making. And I'm looking forward to hearing your proposals and ideas on the way ahead on shaping this new social contract and new global deal, and on making sure that the rebirth of the global economy is done in a way that delivers sustainable development and inclusive development for all. Thank you very much, and my strong wishes of a very productive debate.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. You've got us off to a great start. I'm going to bring in Madame Lagarde now and ask her what she thinks are the priorities in tackling the current crisis and what hope we have of trying to build a better world order. Madame Lagarde.
Well, thank you very much, Nisha, and thank you very much, Secretary General, my friend Antonio. It's so refreshing to hear you constant energy and drive and determination to continue the change and pursue the journey that we have ahead of us. And I know that in the face of reality, and particularly the ones that you face on a global level, it's hard to keep that flame burning, but please do. It's much needed. What I would like to do, Nisha, at this point is use the 5 minutes that I was given to talk briefly about hope, to mention what I see as key risks going forward, and then to describe a little bit the journey that I believe we have to travel. And clearly, as is always the case, you stand where you sit. In other words, you talk about the things that you're dealing most where you are. And I'm clearly not going to talk much about the developing world nor the low-income countries, but the advanced economies that I have to deal with at the moment as head of the ECB. But I think hope is on everybody's horizon. And I think what I call the news of the 9% plus vaccines, which is now in sight, is giving all of us hope. And the situation facing the global economy, while it will remain risky until widespread immunity is achieved, but the prospect of an end to the pandemic should give us confidence that we can shepherd our economies and our society to the other side without unnecessary damage. And I mentioned those words on purpose, unnecessary damage. In many jurisdictions, central banks, fiscal authorities have acted, are already acting to bridge that gap and to protect the fabric of our economies. With decisive policy support, we can defend those businesses that will be viable once the restrictions are removed. And we can also protect those jobs that have no reasons to be destroyed. Remember those two things: businesses that will be viable once restrictions are needed, jobs that have no reasons to be destroyed. By deduction, you know that some businesses will be damaged, some jobs will be gone, and I'll touch on that in a little while. So even with that support, it is clear that COVID-19 will cause lasting changes to our economies. It will not necessarily sap our economy potential if we act powerfully, but it will cause sectoral and societal shifts against which we have to guard and be prepared. Let me identify now 3 big challenges that I see and that we will have to manage in a post-COVID world. The first one that Antonio alluded to is clearly the risk of increased inequality. And it could really cause significant scarring for women and for young people in particular. If I look at the euro area, which is my courtyard now, employment for the people between 15 and 24 years of age has dropped by almost 5% just in the first half of this year, with many of them not even registering with any kind of unemployment system because they're not eligible, but simply disappearing from the world labor force altogether, so not appearing in statistics anymore. Second challenge, we have the spread of digitalization through our economies, that has accelerated irreversibly. And that will not necessarily reduce jobs, but it will clearly reshuffle them. And there have been estimates around that fast automation, as a result of the pandemic in particular, will destroy about 85 million jobs by 2025, but will also create 97 million new jobs. That's a challenge as well. Even if it's a net positive, it's a challenge, and I will come back to that in my journey portion. The third challenge and a risk that I see, but it's a massive opportunity as well that Antonio has very much touched on, is how the pandemic is actually coinciding with the renewed impetus to green our economies. This is also due to the pandemic, because people have come to value greener, more sustainable lifestyles, lower carbon footprints, and that will last. All those trips that at our levels, in our little circles, we considered indispensable, you know, a return trip to Brazil to discuss something critical, well, maybe we'll think twice about that. And that's only a very, very small category, elitist kind of choice. But those choices will be made throughout the organization of our societies. So these challenges will create, no doubt, short-term disruption. But if we seize the opportunity, they also offer a new, more sustainable, more inclusive growth model. The risk of inequality, I'll come back to that, could lead us to refocus our attention to those at the bottom end of the income scale. And this would not only be good policy in and of itself, but good economics too, since those least privileged and poorest in society spend the most out of their incomes. Inclusive growth is the only way to achieve sustainable economic growth. The acceleration of digitalization, which I mentioned as my second challenge, gives us scope to provide great access to essential services, to the teleprovision of health services. How many oncologists have provided special services to their patients during COVID-19 when nobody could move around by telemedicine? Plenty and plenty more than before. The same goes for education. And this could radically address the skill gap that prevents some people from fully participating in the economy, as well as the health gap that leave many people behind. And my third challenge that I mentioned, this renewed focus on the environment gives us the chance to push for less resource-intensive growth based on more digital jobs, intangible investments, and green innovation. A different way of producing, a different way of consuming, a different way of paying are possible. And let's not forget that that 60% of the jobs that we had in 2018 did not exist in 1940. That will happen again, and probably at an accelerated pace than it did in the past. Now, making this transformation is not going to be a walk in the park. Won't be easy. And it means building an environment that rewards experimentation, rewards innovation, tolerates failure. It means harnessing the possibilities of new technologies in the most inclusive possible ways. And it means making sure that we are resilient and able to adapt to new jobs and prepared for the next shocks. But I'm certain that we can get there. The pandemic has shown us the incredible resilience of our societies in the face of unprecedented changes, the incredible resilience and solidarity of people amongst themselves. No one could have imagined a year ago that we would take certain collective actions to face down a common threat as we have. And that should give us hope in forging the future. Two characteristics that I want to finish with. One is, in that journey, which I will summarize for companies like from liquidity to solvency to bankruptcy to starting up again, will involve public and private interests and authorities together. The same for people from employment to income support to retraining to reskilling and possibly to restarting will also involve public and private forces as well as authorities. Central banks will do their job. Thank you.
Madame Lagarde, we would expect nothing less. Thank you very much for giving us those initial thoughts. I didn't expect them to be so positive, I must say. Before we plunge into our discussions, would you all like to see a recap of the discussions that we had before, the previous two roundtables? Here's a short video with the highlights.
I think the first thing that we need to do for many countries is using this crisis to pressure or to pursue more ambitious reform, whether this is on education, health, social safety net, or quality of spending.
And most importantly, how to make our societies more inclusive, more equitable, how to build on this crisis as an opportunity for a better future.
Rebirthing the global economy with the lens of inclusion and sustainability has a woman's face. They are key actors how to rebuild back better with sustainability and equality.
And I think it's a time when it's about rational intelligence, but it's about emotional intelligence as well. And for the many last decades I've experienced in my professional life, I think that we are better at both and combining the two.
COVID has also shown how connected, interconnected, and vulnerable the world is, and how much we need to cooperate and work in solidarity to be able to get out of our problems.
If we want to take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously, kind of walk the talk about those really ambitious goals, the 169 targets beneath them, we really need much more conditionality in the way that governments and different transnational financial institutions provide that finance. So that really requires also aligning the way we think about finance and the role of finance with really industrial strategy.
We don't have a crisis of availability of funds, but it's really about how those funds are allocated.
In terms of resources, it's really critical because we haven't been able to raise taxes from corporations as capital has become so mobile.
Financing has to continue for these countries, both in debt relief, and that the private creditors absolutely have to contribute to that.
Thinking about economic policy, we could give more consideration to questions of governance and rule of law. I would like to see far more emphasis on building jobs that contribute to health, to education, to care, to skills.
I am becoming increasingly opposed to safety nets because I believe that they have become a huge transfer to the developing world, but they don't produce anything. They don't make us become more productive. And essentially, they just keep us poor. So I am saying something, this is amongst us, but I just want to push us to say, all that safety net transfer, what is it producing for Africa, for God's sakes? I would rather give us energy so that we can actually be innovative.
I actually do believe that cash transfers are part of the solution in the short term, whether they're conditional or unconditional, do a huge amount to increase nutrition in the household, keep girls in schools, maintain household welfare beyond a certain threshold.
We need the stronger countries, the developed world, to step forward and to provide the aid and assistance and help these other countries along.
I still think some sort of cash transfers to the SMEs and the informal sector is very important in order to jumpstart the businesses. I think there should be an agreement right now that we will not push for more protectionist policies, not only for trade, but for investment.
And if there's one thing I think we should rebirth, is rebirth what we think finance is in service to. As so many people here have said, it's currently in service to itself, and it must be put in service to humanity and a thriving planet.
Things such as green initiatives, so green spaces, energy efficient buildings, that didn't have a lot of buy-in from the political side, even though they have very positive economic impact.
Africa, for example, has a lot of potential in renewable energy, in solar, in wind, in hydro. So they can now invest in those renewable energy at a lower cost.
You've got renewable energy that can be owned at the level of a household, at the level of enterprise.
Most countries don't maintain this infrastructure very well, but we've shown that it makes a lot of economic sense to spend more on maintenance than on new investments.
global inequalities also show in terms of access to finance and the lack of fiscal solidarity that we have today in our economic system is also paying its price in terms of climate action.
It's very critical that we consider the feminist economics component of it, which is to say that we can't just be thinking about productive work. We need to think about reproductive work.
We can spread the work around. So, for instance, incentivizing part-time work rather than having some people full-time, some people completely unemployed.
So I think this issue demands active labor market policy that provide continuous learning opportunities for better skills.
So using green technologies, using climate smart technologies that can help farmers to increase significantly their productivity, help young people in rural area to get better jobs.
Solely focusing on growth does not work because we end up with these economies that look big and beautiful outside, but it's just a balloon with nothing inside.
It's a big range of views there, not always in agreement with each other. Let's hear now from Carmen Reinhardt, Chief Economist of the World Bank. Dr. Reinhardt, great that you can join us. Can you give us an overview of the impact of the pandemic on developing economies now, especially looking at the debt implications? Dr. Reinhardt, I think you might need to unmute yourself, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I think you can hear me now. It's a real pleasure to be here. And you know, Madame Lagardes is a really tough act to follow. She emphasized hope in her message. I am going to emphasize that realism and above all persistence are going to be very necessary during the period ahead to cope with the effects of the pandemic on the low income and the emerging markets. Let me say that in 5 minutes, it is impossible to cover the depth and the breadth of the impacts of this pandemic on all countries. But as we have heard from prior speakers, this crisis is exceptionally regressive, and it has hit the most vulnerable within countries, but it's also hit the poorest and the most vulnerable across countries. I was asked to focus on where we stand on debt and the debt issues that so many of the emerging and developing countries are facing. Let me start at the beginning, even before COVID. About half of the low-income countries were either in debt distress or approaching debt distress. We had since 2013, we had seen a protracted slowdown in economic growth. We had seen a decline in commodity prices, and so many of the emerging and developing countries rely on primary commodities. So conditions prior to COVID were already a source of concern. Then enter COVID. I think the initial response by the multilaterals of embracing very aggressive, front-loaded, fast dispersing financing to deal with the emergency has been appropriate, very appropriate. In connection to the lending, there's also been the debt service suspension initiative, the DSSI, that the G20 fostered in May of this year, which will allow countries to reallocate scarce resources away from debt servicing into more needed emergency expenditure. Now, the DSSI, of course, has not delivered everything that had been hoped for because private sector participation has been lacking. And I would note that even if private sector participation had been forthcoming, which certainly would have made a great many difference for a great many countries, because many of the low-income countries already became significant borrowers in international credit markets in the previous years. Even with that participation, it would still need to be followed up by something more substantive, which brings me to where we are at the moment, and that is the need to go beyond the SSI and in the framework of the G20, this is the common framework. Now, I spoke about realism and I spoke about persistence. And what do I mean in connection with what lies ahead? As Madame Lagarde mentioned in her remarks, we are transitioning from saying, okay, we have a liquidity problem, to we also, in many instances, have a solvency problem. Many of the poorest countries and many of the middle-income countries are facing debt challenges that we had not seen since the early 1980s. And the reason for realism is that the solutions to debt problems seldom present themselves very quickly. And this time will not be different, I am afraid. There is always a tension between the creditors and the debtors. The debtors need debt forgiveness. The creditors want to hold on. And that delay is a major source of headwind for recovery. So I think a big challenge to the recovery, to recovering better, to recovering more inclusive, a big challenge is this impasse. And you can go back 200 years of analysis of the balance and the give and take between debtors and creditors, and it's always the same. Emergence of a plan for significant, and let me emphasize significant, debt reduction usually doesn't come early. Let me reference, because I think in the spirit of the realism that I highlighted, let me emphasize the experience of the 1980s. In the 1980s, several African countries began to enter a debt crisis in 81. In August of 82, Mexico defaulted. And it was only in 86 that the Baker Plan came together to try to do some debt, more comprehensive across the board debt relief, but it wasn't sufficient. So it is nearly a decade later in 89 that the Brady Plan comes together and does bring an end to the debt crisis in a number of the affected countries. What I am getting at is that the international community has to be both persistent and bold, emphasis on bold, on substantive debt relief, because the historic pattern of granting a little each time just leads to a repetitive process of serial restructuring efforts that fail. And, on the note of realism, I would observe that in 1990, almost 60% of the developing and emerging market countries had per capita income levels below what they were in 1980, the so-called lost decade. That's a real challenge. It's a real source of concern where I think international cooperation and anything that can bring, whether it's at the legal level, whether it's a concerted solution between official creditors and private creditors, but persistence and boldness and realism are very much needed to deal with the debt crisis that is faced at the moment already by so many of the low-income countries, and that list unfortunately gets longer each month. Let me stop there because I do want to end with a message that each party has a role to play. The official creditors, the private creditors, the financial centers can help with legislation, and the debtor countries have to importantly also engage in transparency and ensuring that the communication level with all the creditors facilitates what is likely to be a very protracted period of debt restructuring.
Reinhardt, thank you so much for setting out a very realistic stall, rather worrying, I would say. I think I took away from it that Carmen Reinhardt was calling for the setting up of a better mechanism, a whole international process to make sure that these debt issues are dealt with more systematically and that we don't just constantly reinvent the wheel every time a country runs into trouble. Let's see what our economists think in a minute or two. We're about to start our roundtable now. Let me introduce you to not 1, 2, or 3, but no less than 10 extremely eminent economists. The first part of our discussion is going to look at immediate actions that they recommend should be taken to tackle this economic crisis, the worst in 100 years. Now, who should I start with? Perhaps with Nobel laureate Paul Krugman. Professor Krugman, you have said that the US needs a really, really big economic relief package. So explain to us what you mean by that, the urgency, the scope.
Okay, so where we are now, thank you, Nisha. Where we are now is actually conceptually very simple. We're now in a race between the coronavirus and the vaccines that we have very good reason to believe will bring an end to this pandemic sometime next year. The trouble is that unless we do something to curb it, the logic of exponential growth means that the coronavirus will win that race, and very large numbers of people will die or suffer permanent impairment to their health along the way. What we need to do, therefore, is curb the spread of the virus, as we have done intermittently and imperfectly so far, with a lot of restrictions on activity that basically break that transmission chain. The trouble is those restrictions also mean a loss of income, a loss of livelihood. And so the immediate task of economic policy is provide compensation so that we can get through, so that people can manage through this period of waiting for the vaccine to arrive, which also has the secondary effect of containing secondary damage to the rest of the economy because of the reduced purchasing power of people who cannot earn their normal incomes. We need to fund public health measures. We need to fund the extraordinary expenses that are coming about because of the pandemic. And we need to do all of that for a limited period, though we're not sure exactly how long. 6 months, 8 months, we're not quite sure how long it will be, but we need to provide funding at adequate levels. And we have a pretty good idea of how big that funding has to be. It's given where we are, where the state of the economy, the effects of the restrictions, we're talking about something in excess of 5% of GDP, but probably less than 10% of GDP. We're talking in the order of, well, certainly more than $100 billion a month. And I think that's the right units in which to think, possibly $200 billion a month, which the United States can easily afford. So we actually know exactly what to do. We need to do what we did in the early stages of the pandemic, only more comprehensively. We need to be funding healthcare. We need to be funding state and local governments in ways that we did not do adequately. We need to be compensating the unemployed and businesses with a time limit, although it's not a rigid moment of exhaustion. It's just until we have immunity from the vaccine. The longer run issues are far more complex, but the short run is the simplest thing I've ever seen in economics. This is just build a bridge to the vaccine. And it's going to be an expensive bridge, but we can afford it, and it's well worth doing.
I understood it. Build a bridge to the vaccine. It doesn't matter how expensive it'll be because it'll be time limited. But what about if you don't belong to a big, rich country like the US? Let's get a voice from Africa now. I'm going to call in Vera Songwe. Vera, you're the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. What about low-income countries in Africa who, firstly, can't see an insight to the pandemic necessarily, and secondly, are suffering from these major liquidity issues that we were hearing from earlier from Carmen Reinhardt? What do you think we should be doing now?
Thank you very much, Nisha. I think Christine spoke about hope and Carmen about realism. I'm going to talk about innovation. And I think when we look today at the low-income countries on the continent or the emerging, I like to call them emerging or frontier economies, just because the connotation also gives them a sense that there is a bridge to growth and a bridge to better prosperity. The African sovereign debt landscape has, over the last decade, grown and changed significantly. And, when we look at sort of what Carmen was talking about, 20 years ago, we had that almost complete reliance on official creditors. So when you had an event like the one we're facing today, the Paris Club got together and found a solution. But today, S&P estimates that about 30 to 49% of all the sovereign debt that is issued on the continent is actually held by private investors. And this diversification has come at a cost, because 60% of the debt service payment today is held in the hands of the private sector. And I think this is where we need to be innovative today. And Christine is no longer there, but we need to, the tension that we're facing today is we're trying to use, as Carmen said, 1980 and the Brady Bill, to solve a problem whose dimensions are totally different and where the actors have changed substantially. If you look at the G20 debt service framework that was just discussed last Friday, hardly any private sector around the table. How can we solve a problem where 60% of the problem is not in the room? And I think there is and there must be a way of beginning to acknowledge the fact that we have a different set of financial players, and then begin to look at how we revise the financial architecture to have this conversation in a different way. And this brings me to the conversation on liquidity. Again, Christine is talking about hope, and it's possible to talk about hope when you're backed by a hard currency like the euro and you can disburse $750-something billion to put a floor to the crisis and provide some liquidity that immediately, I don't know if you can still hear me. Seems like I'm having connectivity problems. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Nisha?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes, Mahmoud says he can hear me. My screen went blank for a minute. I was saying, we need to do a couple of things. The first one is to say for those countries that we can then ensure can actually build a faster Paul's analogy, create an innovation that says, let's find a way of crowding in the private sector and build a bridge faster to growth and renewed growth by allowing a lot of the liquidity that is in the private sector to come to the aid of the low income and developing countries. And how can we do that? I think there's a number of different ways of doing it. One of them, of course, is using official assistance to crowd in private sector financing to provide quick liquidity to some of the countries that we can still salvage, that we can still ensure continue to grow. We all know collectively, and Carmen has said it herself, when these countries fall into solvency issues, it's much more difficult for us to pull them out. So the choice for us is to say, do we wait for them to fall into solvency, or do we crowd in the private sector and ensure that we can build an innovative, faster, more sustainable bridge to continuous prosperity as we talk about this? And let's remember
that the low-income countries, but the emerging frontier economies of the world today are also the economies that host almost 60% of the world's poor. Everybody who has spoken today has spoken about inequality. So if we turn a blind eye to the 60% of the world's poor in our emerging market economies, there is no way that we can solve the crisis of COVID, because even the bridge, Paul, to the vaccine, the SG just said we are still missing resources to close that gap. It is in these countries where we have the world's poor that we will not be able to close the gap. And we cannot afford, as we did in 1980, to wait 10 years for a solution to this problem. We need to do it now. We need to extend the DSSI through the end of 2021. We need to get the $500 billion in SDRs to come to the table. We need to find some way through a liquidity and sustainability facility to crowd in the private sector, reduce the cost of money. 54 African countries, only 2 have been able to go back to the market since the crisis. Italy has a debt to GDP of 155%. They're going to the market at much, much, much cheaper rates than any African country with much better macroeconomic fundamentals. There is an inherent inconsistency in how we're trying to solve this problem, and we must tackle that through some innovative solutions.
We have someone with us in our panel who knows all about managing a crisis in the thick of managing a debt crisis, really, and trying to meet the needs, the basic humanitarian needs of the people. And that is Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece. What do you think, looking at this crisis, the pandemic crisis, as to what do you think are the most urgent priorities right now, Mr. Varoufakis?
Thank you, Nisha. In order for us to be able to conjure up hope, as Christine Lagarde said, we need to look at the system we have in place, and which has been doing all the heavy lifting since the 2008 great financial crisis. Christine said that central banks are here and they are doing their job. I don't doubt that. But how well is the energy, the liquidity that central banks, not just the ECB, but the Fed and the rest, how well is it functioning in the context of actually having a positive impact when it comes to good quality jobs on the one hand, and producing the green technologies and green energy that we need to mitigate climate change? And I very much fear that the system is utterly broken. And this is not a criticism of the central banks. It's a criticism, if you want, of the rest of government and of our economic blocks. And I shall try to explain this by means of an example. When the Fed or the Bank of England or the ECB today, in the context of the pandemic, or actually since 2009, when they print a large amount of money in order to put a floor under the crisis, whether it's the great financial crisis in 2009 or today the COVID-19 induced global recession, what happens is there's a middleman, there's a commercial bank. The central bank is obliged effectively to pass the money on to the commercial bank. The commercial bank then picks up the phone and usually calls a large company, a mega firm, because they are the safest bet, and says, I've got 20, 30, 50 billion for you at a minuscule interest rate. Those corporations, look at Apple, for instance, just one example. These corporations already have a stash of cash due to the secular stagnation, as Barry Summers put it, which they are not investing, but they take the central bank money through the commercial bank. And what do? They go to the stock exchange and they buy back their own shares. That creates asset price inflation, share prices go up. The board of directors are loving it because their bonuses are connected to the share price, but there is no real tangible investment in the things society needs, either good quality jobs or the green transition.
So sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Varoufakis. Are you saying there is a more effective way of using all this liquidity that's sloshing around to deliver the jobs that we need?
Well, let me give you 2 examples. One is, for instance, in the context of the European Union, but that is scalable beyond the European Union. The European Investment Bank could be given a green light by the European Union Council to issue bonds worth 5% of GDP for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, And the ECB can do what it already is doing, standing behind them in the secondary markets. And that creates a large fund by which to effect a Green New Deal in Europe, rather than the Green Deal that we now have, which is unfunded more or less. And also it crowds in private investment. The second example that I want to give is, helicopter money. Instead, cutting out the middleman can work very directly by, imagine in March, September, or even today during the second lockdown, if Madame Lagarde's bank were to credit every resident in the European Union with 2,000 euros, and that can be taxed at the end of the year depending on total income. The Australian government managed in 2009 to avert recession by means of this kind of policy. The Hong Kong Central Bank did more or less the same thing last March. It can be done, it has been done, and it can be scaled up to a much broader level. For instance, the World Bank could do that which I suggested that the European Investment Bank could be doing. The issue at the moment is that the one bazooka we have against the crisis, central banks, are creating liquidity that on the one hand are working as a palliative, but on the other hand, they are creating long-term repercussions, increasing inequalities, not creating good quality jobs, not helping with climate change mitigation, and zombifying lots of corporations in the process.
Very well put. Thank you for coming up with a couple of practical suggestions for us, which we will recommend to the Secretary General, Yanis Varoufakis there. I'm going to call in Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones now. She is a very eminent development economist, also worked extensively on the issues of financial market access. So Professor Griffith-Jones, do you agree with what Vera Songway was saying a bit earlier before we heard from Yanis Varoufakis? She was saying DFSI need to be extended, the whole scheme. We need those SDRs to be issued. We need to crowd in the private sector. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would start with following up from Yanis Varoufakis, saying that we need nationally and internationally a financial sector that is fit for purpose. We always need it, but we need it particularly now because we have the urgent task of funding the recovery from COVID and also financing the structural transformation to a greener and more inclusive economy. So I think that in the short term, I think it's absolutely crucial to have a new SDR issue of 500 billion, which would be double what was done in the global financial crisis. We have a bigger crisis now. And I think we have hope, taking Christine Lagarde's word, because we have hope with the new US administration that we can persuade them, because they are the only country that voted against the new issue of SDRs. And this has no fiscal cost, and it will benefit all countries. There can be mechanisms for redistributing this towards poorer countries that need it most, but it will also benefit the world economy. Possible risks are inflation, but that is not a problem. The second thing that I would like to stress is we need to increase the role of multilateral, regional, and national development banks. And in that, I also agree a lot with Yanis. We have these fantastic institutions, which at the moment hold over $11 trillion of assets and have operations of over $2 trillion of assets. And if we, for example, increase by 20% their transactions, that would yield to $400 billion a year. And if you co-finance it with the private sector, it could be $800 billion a year. And I think we have no option because we have these institutions which have several advantages. One is that they provide value for money to governments which have very limited resources. Because if you increase the capital of, for example, the European Investment Bank, it was increased in 2012 by only 10 billion euros. And with that, the EIB was able to increase lending by 16-fold, by 160 billion. So you have this tremendous leverage or value for money. Governments love it because it means doing more with less, as the Europeans like to say. Secondly, they're an instrument of policy steer because they can channel the funds, both their own funds and those that they're co-financing with the private sector, towards meeting the sustainable development goals, and particularly towards goals of creating jobs, good jobs, and also, of course, protecting the planet. So we need these development banks, particularly multilateral ones, but also at a national level, to be able to channel. We need this mechanism from savers to investors. And they can do it, they can work with the private sector, but they need to take the lead so they can channel the resources towards our urgent needs. And I think this is particularly important in a period when we want to rebuild the economies from COVID, provide enough support for vaccines, but also move towards a greener and more inclusive economy. And finally,
I'm going to take the mic from you at that point, if you don't mind, so I can bring in another thought. But it's very good to hear the way you chimed in with what we heard, both from Vera Somewhere and from Yanis Varoufakis. Thank you for now. We'll hear from you a little later on. I'd like to pull in Professor Peter Henry now, who's known for his work in challenging conventional wisdom on debt relief and international capital flows. I am a little puzzled about something, Professor. Could you explain to us why some countries, despite the debt issues we've been hearing about and the major economic consequences of the pandemic, some middle-income countries like Jamaica have managed to access emergency funds from the IMF? They have managed to implement economic stimulus packages, and yet so many haven't. What's going on?
Thank you, Nisha. So, and thank you for mentioning my home country of Jamaica, which is, I think, for the first time in almost 40 years, a shining example of actually outstanding economic policy. Jamaica has been able to access stimulus funds from the IMF quite simply because Jamaica has been following disciplined economic policy. So Carmen Reinhardt mentioned James Baker's speech over 30 years ago. The essence of Baker's speech was that countries need to be disciplined in order to grow. Jamaica's exercised not only fiscal discipline in creating the fiscal space that it needed to complete its IMF program successfully, but Jamaica has also embraced a more open economy, opening itself up to trade, maintaining openness to trade. And this is really crucial, not just for Jamaica, but for the world generally. So if we look at middle income emerging and developing economies, between 1980 and 1994, they grew at 3.5% per year. Since that time, from 1995 through the pre-COVID period, emerging and developing economies grew at 5.5% per year. And it's because of a simple word, discipline, being more disciplined about their economic policy. So we can't forget, Nisha, that as important as the fiscal space that Jamaica created to allow it to access IMF funds is, what put Jamaica on that path was an openness to trade and advance economies in order to help continue to drive growth and to drive a turnaround, not just in Jamaica, but in the world economy more generally, need to embrace, frankly, the important lessons we've learned from globalization, which is that trade can be good for everybody. It isn't always good for everybody. And we have to make sure that we implement the right social safety nets in those countries to make sure that trade benefits everybody, because that's the only way we can have a positive sum outcome. So I think they're big lessons from a small island for the world as a whole. And I would just add to that, Nisha, following up on what Carmen also said, is that the debt relief initiatives so far by the G20 have been largely insufficient. The DSSI has been, to use a phrase, bring a water pistol to a firefight. And importantly, the G20 countries need to also make sure they're committed to additionality. That is not just writing down the debt, but actually continuing to give aid. Because in the past, when there has been debt relief, the G20 countries have always substituted debt relief for aid, so there's been no additional resource flows to developing countries. So lots of lessons from Jamaica, and big lessons for the global economy.
Okay, Professor Peter Henry, thank you very much for joining us. I think our next speaker might bring in a rather different point of view to what we've just heard. Professor Danny Roderick wrote that big famous book more than 20 years ago now, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? Was one of the first to raise concerns about those losing out from international trade and globalization. So I want to ask you, if we are going to see big geysers of public expenditure in the rich world, sort of thing that Paul Krugman was talking to us about earlier. How do we make sure that it's put to best use to protect and support communities that feel that they have been left behind?
Thank you, Nisha. It's been a really interesting set of views. I think the countries that have really done very well in the past are those that have combined the opportunities that globalization presents with coherent domestic growth and development and investment strategy. So it always, successful development requires both of those legs. That is having access to global technology, global markets, global finance, but also having coherent domestic investment strategies. And I think that those have been always a mix of relying on the market, but also on the guiding hand of the states. Let's not forget that the most important poverty reduction experience that the world has ever experienced is that of China, which is a country that's is certainly completely unorthodox in terms of its economic policies. But I think the big issue as we turn forward and as we move from the more short-term issues to the more sort of medium-term kinds of issues is to realize that there's a sense in which the lessons of the past will not necessarily be a very good guide for the future. I mean, we've talked about sort of establishing a bridge, and I think the kinds of policies that we need to put in the short term also have to establish a bridge towards the kind of economic policies that we need. And the reason that past experience is not necessarily going to be a good guide is because the challenges are very different. We need to make a transition to a green economy, so the climate challenge looms much larger and can't be avoided. And it's also the case that the standard kind of growth strategy that worked very well in the past, which was based on export-oriented industrialization, putting a lot of your people into labor-intensive manufacturing and then sort of moving from there, that already as a model of growth was petering out prior to COVID. I don't think it's coming back. I think industrialization's manufacturing's capacity to absorb a lot of low-skilled workers in low-income countries is largely exhausted, although some countries still have some room, but they won't be able to essentially duplicate what the East Asian and other successful countries have done. So we do need, broadly speaking, industrial policies, but they will look very different from those in the past. They'll be much less, I think, export focused. They'll be much more services focused rather than manufacturing. They'll be much less top down. We'll be much more sort of collaboratively working together with private sector and other stakeholders. And the disappointing thing here is that actually we don't have a model here that we can really sort of emulate. So I think we will need a lot of experimentation. So part of this, transition is certainly making sure that the finance is there, as you say, and what a lot of the previous speakers have highlighted. But we also need new models, new ideas, and we will need to engage in significant amount of policy experimentation, to go back to the term that I think Ms. Lagarde used before.
Professor Roderick, thank you very much. So clearly, Professor Roderick is telling us there are no easy solutions ahead. There is possibly a bumpy and uncertain path as economies transition to take a greater focus on services rather than manufacturing jobs, wherever you might be. Let's go to South Africa now. Busi Sebeki, we saw her. Hello, Busi. We saw you in the video because she was part of one of the earlier roundtables. You're an economic researcher working in South Africa on poverty, inequality, underdevelopment issues. South Africa, as you know, had a very early and stringent lockdown, didn't it? It created a lot of hardship, saw a lot of joblessness. What do you see as the most immediate economic priorities? And is there a role for the UN in all this?
Thank you for that question. I think I want to refocus our conversation a bit and to remember that the current moment, how responding to this current moment will determine what kind of rebirthing is needed later, and to emphasize that this is a health crisis that's basically triggered and exacerbated many other existing crises, which include social reproduction crises, unemployment, poverty, inequality, all of these along racial, gender, ableness, and other intersectional lines. And I think it is critical that we recenter that and to say that we need to save lives and livelihoods, because how do you rebirth a new economy when you haven't done the immediate thing that needs to happen? So I want to put forward a couple of things that are going to be critical. One, it will be important that we assess how countries have responded. We can't put, the cart in front of the horse. How have countries responded now? It is, of course, easier to resuscitate a living economy and society than to resuscitate a dead economy. I think it is critical in South Africa that the fact that we haven't fully implemented the packages that were announced of 500 billion rand has meant that, in the quarter two of this year, 2.2 million jobs were lost. Half of people went hungry. 40% of people now are unemployed in South Africa, and this is going to increase if there's no immediate realization of a response that saves the current moment, saves lives and livelihoods. Two, I think what is critical is that we all need to assess, especially in the developing world, what have countries promised? Did they implement responses to this current moment? And have they sufficiently mobilized the resources that were available to respond to the immediate crisis, right? And the last one, or the second to last one, is what have they delivered? In South Africa, we had our lockdown 9 months ago, and it is critical that where we are is that we do not move too far towards what do we do in the future, but to say that in the time that has passed, what has been implemented, and to hold governments accountable and private sector accountable to this current moment, to say that you need to respond immediately now. It's not a question about tomorrow. And I think lastly, we need to ask ourselves, what is the cost of not responding in the immediate run? What is the cost in terms of human lives? What is the cost in terms of livelihoods? And I think without centering those conversations, we will wake up to see an economy and society that has changed so much that we're going to have this conversation again about rebirthing the global economy. But this time we'll be talking about a different context because we've let go of the current moment and have not sufficiently responded to people's immediate needs, which are material.
Lucy, could I ask you, who is supposed to hold governments accountable? What is the mechanism by which we can do this?
Excuse me, can you please repeat that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
So my question is, what is the mechanism by which governments can be held accountable? Who is supposed to do it? Who scrutinizes these promises made by South Africa and other governments?
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations can play a critical role in this. We know that there's an international convention on economic, social, and cultural rights, socioeconomic and cultural rights. And I think that is one of the tools that can be put to say, how have countries fared against human rights obligations that they've said they will deliver on? And I think civil society also plays a critical role. And of course, I'm from civil society, so a bit biased, but to say we need to put pressure on our governments to say, you have promised this, have you delivered? Or you haven't promised anything at all, and why is that? Because we know the resources exist.
Mr. Becker, thank you very much for joining us with that. There's another idea for you, Secretary General, a role for some part of the UN, hold governments accountable. I'm not sure how that one's going to go down. I'm now going to bring in a voice from Singapore. Professor Danny Quah, you're known for your analysis of large-scale shifts in the global economy. Now, many countries in East Asia have had a very different kind of experience from what we've been hearing so far. They've actually managed the pandemic and the economic fallout very well by reacting quickly, taking the virus seriously, and really getting on top of the situation. So are there any lessons, do you think, for the rest of the world?
Thank you, Nisha. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And every time someone said something, I want to jump to agree. But at the end of it, it came my turn to speak. I wondered if I might try and inject maybe a touch of uncertainty. I'm not entirely clear that we know the parameters of what we're dealing with here, nor am I convinced that we've got the right conceptual model. So the way I try and think about the weak and vulnerable in the world, what we need to do in terms of economic policy, what's happening around me in East Asia. Yeah, I put myself in the position of a disadvantaged worker, the weak and vulnerable. And I'm in this society. I'm in the midst of this raging COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm looking at the government or the policymaker, and I'm saying, what are you going to do in terms of economic policy? And I understand when they tell me, or when I read these accounts, well, you know, the lockdown is really to keep infections and deaths down. It's got this unfortunate impact on economic performance. I know that we want to get back to jobs and growth, and I want to help you. So as soon as I can, I will jazz up spending. I will get the economy going again. And here's where I worry, you see, because when I look across the data of what's happening in the world in terms of GDP growth, deaths, infections, there's no clear correlation. Deaths are all over the map. Deaths normalized by population, no less so. You know, Germany and Singapore are both projected by IMF to be minus 6% on GDP growth. So you think, okay, we've got dramatic lockdowns here. But Germany is suffering 168 deaths per million, while Singapore is experiencing 4.5. China, of course, as you were saying, you know, is the big example that we all look at for how economic growth has come hand in hand with control of the pandemic. And China's positive growth this year comes with a death per million of 3. America's minus 4.3% is simultaneous with a death per million of almost 800. That all these numbers are all over the map. So I worry about whether we've got the right handle on economic policy that will help us take off. So instead, although here I am in the midst of East Asia, as you say, Nisha, where things seem to be relatively successful, I want to suggest that we take a more measured approach to this, that we manage expectations. We don't think about, you know, getting the economy bouncing back, but we think about actions that we can take, government spending that we can take that will keep reserves strong. The point is that when the economy restarts, we want all to emerge stronger, not necessarily to go back to the roaring growth that we had before, but about returning the economy in a managed way. It should instead, policy should instead be about building reserves to emerge stronger, not to bounce back. And I think that is the thinking that a lot of East Asia has taken to this. We've gotten the deaths and infections under control, and we're gradually opening up the economy in a managed way. Back to you, please.
Thanks very much, Professor Kwa. So a note of realism there, really, from Professor Kwa. And considering that, continuing that focus on health, I'd like to bring in Professor Ha-Joon Chung now, who's written a number of very interesting books. He's a development economist, but he's written books which have been pretty controversial, haven't you, including Kicking Away the Ladder. I wonder if I can borrow that title to ask you whether we're seeing the rich world kicking away the ladder in a way, metaphorically speaking, in terms of vaccine access. Because we've seen America, the US, the UK, the EU gobbling up vaccine supply for the next year, and God knows what's going to happen to the developing world, is right to the back of the queue. What do you think we can do to try and address that?
Well, thank you, Nisha, for that question. First of all, at the very surface level, accessibility to vaccine or any other medicine is a matter of money. You know, the Secretary General has mentioned this $20 billion funding gap in the COVAX program and so on. But when it comes to things like medicine, how much money it costs is not determined entirely by market forces, because when you invent a new medicine, you get a patent which gives you monopoly right for 20 years, which allows you to charge a lot more than what costs to make the medicine. So as we already saw in the debate surrounding HIV/AIDS, the medicines that centered around in South Africa in the early 2000s, you know, the pharmaceutical companies that that have the monopoly rights that can literally charge at 20, 30 times what it costs to make medicine. So I think we need to address this issue of the intellectual property rights, in this case, patents. Now, some of the companies that are developing vaccines have said they are going to kind of limit the exercise of their patent rights during the pandemic. But that's very unsatisfactory because what happens after the pandemic? You know, the WHO declares the pandemic to be over, but then there are the viruses raging in certain developing countries. Do they have to pay the full price for this medicine? Also, let's not forget that these companies got the very large government funding to develop this medicine. So they need to restrain they need to be restrained in their ability to charge monopoly price beyond the pandemic. Now, I accept that pharmaceutical companies need incentives to invent new things, but these needs need to be balanced against other needs. The need to keep people safe, the need to prevent hundreds of thousands of people dying. And this is why even in the currently very pro-patentee regime of intellectual property rights that prevails in the world, especially through the TRIPS agreement in the WTO, there are provisions for suspending or restricting patentee rights that in case of health emergency and other public interests. The US itself, back in 2001, when there was that famous anthrax scare, basically that threatened to mobilize a provision to force Bayer, which had the patent for the anthrax drug Citro, to give it like 80-90% discount. So this has been done by the rich countries. Once again, the idea of kicking out the ladder, do as I say, not as I do. That there are these provisions, and I hear that India and South Africa have brought this issue to the WTO, and I think we really need a serious discussion on what we are going to do in terms of the patent issues, more broadly intellectual property rights issues related to the medicines that we need to deal with the COVID crisis, whether they are vaccines or the treatment drugs.
Professor Cham, thank you very much for joining us. It's a very interesting idea, very difficult to implement, though, I must say, but could give hope, the hope that Christine Lagarde was talking to us about, not just to the rich world, but also to the whole world. I'm going to bring in our final economist now, Dr. Mohammed El-Erian. He's Chief Economic Advisor to the mighty financial group Allianz, was for many years at the top of the investment management field. I'm going to give you the difficult job, Dr. El-Erian, of trying to draw together some of these themes. Step back for a moment. What do you think is most essential at this point to protect the really vulnerable and stop the scarring of our economies?
Thank you, Nisha. When you say summarize everybody else, I think of it as you have nothing interesting to say, which is true, because we've had 12 amazing speakers. But it's also a very good way of disciplining me to listen and think of what other people have said. It's an old trick that is used in leadership, which is use structure to do the heavy lifting. And I say that because whether it was Carmen Reinhardt, emphasis on persistence and realism, Peter Henry on discipline, Paul Krugman saying, we know what we need to do next, but it's beyond that. This notion of we have to be disciplined, we have to be structured, comes through. And I can tell you that the image that I keep on thinking, whether it was in the video or listening to you all, is from one of my favorite movies, Amadeus, when Mozart plays an incredible piece to the Austrian emperor. And the Austrian emperor's response was, too many notes. So we risk having too many good ideas and end up by leaving too many on the side. So let me talk a little bit about what I think is key, what I've heard. One is everybody has agreed that this crisis is what I call the great unequalizer. It is resulting in a significant worsening, not just of income and wealth inequality, but the inequality of opportunity. And the minute you talk about opportunity, you talk about scarring, you talk about multiple generations falling behind. Women and girls are most vulnerable, but there's a lot of people in that vulnerable category. The strong get stronger, the weak get weaker, and we have a lot of disadvantaged people to start with. So that comes out very, very strongly. The other thing that comes out very strongly is the strong can't protect themselves from spillback, whether it is migration, whether it is a reckoning for those who have done well. The spillbacks are going to be real. And we need to realize this because everybody has an interest in addressing relief and addressing scarring. The other thing you hear is hope. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the so-called Sputnik moment where we wake up to a new reality and we can bring everybody together on this. The problem is overcoming behavioral issues, is how do you get everybody focused and persistent? How do you stop the mistake of the global financial crisis where we collectively won the war against the global depression, but we lost the peace? We failed miserably to establish a peace of high, inclusive, sustainable growth. So let me suggest that things I've heard basically fall into a framework. And the way to move forward is not to impose individual actions on the groups, because people here talked about a massive matrix. You have countries across, you have governments, you have civil society, you have corporates, you have private sector, you have households. That is a really complex matrix. So instead of trying to be micro, turn it around and do, Nisha, what you did to me, which is use a framework to discipline. And that framework, and this is what I'm going to conclude, has 5 areas. Relief. We heard from Paul Krugman on the importance of that. We heard from Carmen and others on debt, on the importance of debt relief, just the notion of relief. Second, live better with COVID. We still have a good 6 to 9 months, so perhaps even longer. And unless we learn to live better with COVID, we're going to come out with too much scarring. Third, enable people, whether you call it supply side measure, whether you call it embrace digitalization, AI, big data, whether you call redefining the financial sector. I agree with all this. I also would emphasize retooling, retraining, education, and infrastructure. It's about enabling people. Fourth, let's address household economic insecurity. Let's make sure that the demand side doesn't end up by being the problem. And finally, let's always have someone asking the question, are we doing consistent with sustainability, especially on climate, governance, and global responsibility? I think if we think of a global compact with these 5 elements and then challenge people, whether it is countries or whether it is segments within countries, to come in and say, what are you doing? And we learn from each other's best practices, we will end up once again winning the war because of the amazing progress our scientists have made on vaccines, but losing the peace that has eluded us for too long. Thank you.
Dr. Larian, thank you very much. So that's a huge challenge ahead for us. Bigger challenge really is whether some good can come out of this awful pandemic with so much loss of life and so many lost jobs. We heard from the Secretary General at the moment that he thinks this is a moment for a quantum leap. How do we develop something like that? How do we deliver it? Well, one ray of hope, of course, are the big climate action investment funds we keep hearing about. How do we make sure that inclusion is part of them, not just sustainability? And I'm going to put that question now, looking to the future, thinking about how we build better foundations, to Professor Peter Blair Henry. So, Professor Henry, these green deals we keep hearing about, how do we make sure that it's not just the developing world that benefits from them?
Thank you, Nisha. So I think it's very important to put together a lot of what's been said here. We need to define reality and give hope. And infrastructure investment in the developing world, I want to argue, is the single biggest opportunity to simultaneously achieve net zero emissions, increased global growth, particularly in developing countries, and reduced inequality, right? So just think about the following statistics. There are 940 million people in the developing world who have no access to electricity. There are another billion people that live more than 2 kilometers from an all-season road. So you think about Mohammed's point about enabling people, right? We need infrastructure to enable these billion people to have access to whether it's locally grown services to generate growth or the global economy. Infrastructure is going to be a critical part of the story. And to just make the point even more forcefully, right? The billion people that I referred to, they live in countries that are currently adding 1.7 million workers per month to the labor force, and will continue to do so between now and 2020, right? So the only way which we're going to find ways to absorb this enormous growth in population, this enormous growth in the labor force, is by enabling these countries to generate the economic growth they're going to need to move forward. But in order to do this, Nisha, we have to make sure we don't fall down on the job again. So in particular, I want to talk about the World Bank. So we need better data to make fact-based decisions about where it's actually efficient to invest in roads and electricity to generate gains to GDP in the developing world. And where that information is going to come from, the World Bank has to play a central role in that. And the World Bank, frankly, has fallen down on the job in the last 30 years. I hope Carmen Reinhardt will actually drive an initiative to get us better data on which to base decisions about where it's actually efficient to invest in infrastructure in the developing world, and where we can, very importantly, because we've talked a lot about debt today, one of the reasons we're seeing the massive debt stress in Africa and much of the developing world is because, to put it bluntly, infrastructure in the developing world so far has been largely funded under the Belt and Road Initiative, which has not necessarily had economic efficiency at its heart. And so we need global institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, the WTO, the US Treasury. We've got to have a conversation about how we actually get private sector financing to play a central role. Governments need to lead in creating the confidence locally in institutions to allow private financing to play a role here. But there's an opportunity here for a win-win.
Okay, Professor Henry, I'm going to take the mic away from you there, very clearly put. So clearly, Professor Henry is concerned that the big beasts of the international financial order have not delivered so far and need to be reformed and gingered up. What about the role for public sector development banks in delivering this infrastructure and the Green Climate Action Programme? Let's bring in Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones now. You're a big champion of public sector development banks. How effective can they be in trying to make sure that we have inclusive and sustainable development going forward?
I think that the development banks are one very important mechanism, for example, for financing infrastructure, because one of the main advantages they have is that they fund themselves on the capital market and obtain very long-term finance, and then they can channel it and they can be patient capital and wait till these projects become profitable. This is a problem with private finance, that they seek very short-term returns, and therefore they cannot fund a project which will take 20 years to become profitable. So public development banks have this big advantage. And now, of course, we have the big challenge of having green infrastructure. We need renewable energy at a major scale, both to satisfy the needs of poor people who don't have enough access to electricity, but also to help the planet.
And so, I think Dr. Jones, how effective are they, public sector development banks?
I think this is a very nice example to illustrate your question, where, for example, the German Development Bank, KfW, working together with the German government, designed a policy and put resources into solar energy. And it was the only funder of solar energy in Germany and developed this very successful industry. And then the Chinese Development Bank, also working with its government, developed on a massive scale funding for solar energy, outcompeted Germany and the United States, which was bad for their firms, but they massively reduced the cost of solar panels. And now solar energy has become competitive worldwide in most countries and in most regions. So they've provided a massive public good.
Okay, so an interesting point there, Professor Griffith-Jones. I'm going to take the mic from you if you don't mind. Public sector development banks, they're actually creating new markets. Perhaps that's why the UK is toying with the idea right now. And perhaps that's one of the mechanisms to try and develop real sinews for a better and more stable economy going forwards. I'd like to bring in Paul Krugman. Professor Krugman, I've seen you write on the challenges of the climate crisis, both in a very gloomy way and also quite an optimistic way at times. So I'm going to ask you this. How can we frame climate action in such a way that it is positive, that we rely more on carrots than on sticks, and is inclusive?
Yeah, my take on this has been that a lot of my colleagues, a lot of people like those of us in this discussion have tended to go for the Econ 101 solution, which is say, well, climate is about emissions, emissions is an externality, we should have a carbon tax, which has two problems. First, it's probably wrong on the economics. Dealing with climate change is in very large part an investment issue. It's a question of investment in R&D and in suitable infrastructure, not just about giving individuals incentives. And secondly, politically, it's very, it's an eat your spinach policy recommendation, and it's just not going to happen soon enough to avoid catastrophe. So what we need to do is frame climate action as an investment agenda. It's about building a green infrastructure. It's about building new projects. It's about wrapping climate policies in with lots of other good stuff as a job creation measure. There's a tendency, particularly among academic economists, to think that policy recommendations should be pure, that they shouldn't involve a lot of log rolling and a lot of, they shouldn't be Christmas trees. But in fact, we want this policy to be a Christmas tree, because what we need to do is get action, which means that we need to sell it as part of a package that does lots of good stuff. And it turns out that everybody, the advanced world, but even more so the developing world, desperately needs a lot of infrastructure investment of all kinds. There's every reason to have a policy that saves the planet, along with creating much needed infrastructure, much needed jobs. So I think we need to just stop being purists. We need to start saying, okay, what is the policy that we can actually sell politically? And after all, there's a whole lot of good things. Why not package them together?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Krugman. So if economists are going to stop being purists, what on earth does that mean? I'm going to ask Professor Danny Kwa in Singapore to chew on this. A bigger sort of philosophical question, really, Professor. Do you think that there's a shift in the zeitgeist that's been brought about, accelerated perhaps by the COVID pandemic, so that we're not all obsessing on the altar of economic efficiency all the time?
Thank you, Nisha. I do. And one of the reasons is that the coronavirus crisis is a very individual-centered crisis. It's life or death. It's scarring of my lung tissue versus a global financial crisis, which is kind of out there. So this crisis has made individuals look hard at the trade-off between, they might not think about it in these terms, individual responsibility versus social well-being. They're looking hard at performance legitimacy. They're looking to governments and states, separating out those that do good for their people versus states that don't. And in the midst of all this, they're thinking, why have we built an economic machine that is honed to razor-sharp efficiency, when instead we should be building things that are resilient, that work for all individuals? And I think the coronavirus crisis has forced people to look hard at these issues in a way that maybe the global financial crisis did not. Back to you, please.
Thank you very much. So it looks like there could be changes that are only just beginning to come through, that we're only beginning to imagine how they might work out. And I'm going to ask Dr. Eria now to enter into a thought exercise with us. If Professor Kwa is right and the zeitgeist is changing and the shibboleths of economic efficiency are being challenged, what might that mean for some of these really big infrastructure projects, these Green Deal projects that are likely to come rolling down? Are we going to see more local provision of jobs being mandated, more stipulations, really, that people should be at the heart of them?
So what makes this period really exciting is that there's so many moving pieces that unless you bring them together, you risk frustration. I couldn't agree more on the infrastructure point, and I couldn't agree more on ask yourself why it is that we don't do enough R&D. What is the institutional failure? What is the market failure? And most of the time, it is intervention on the public sector side that's part of the solution. But it's going to happen in a world in which globalization will look very different because of the issues you've raised. We're going to have much more localized globalization. And we can either say we don't like it and argue against it, or we can acknowledge it's coming and channel it in a positive way. So ask a multinational today, are you going to have less globally diverse supply chain? And the answer will be yes. Yes. Why? Because I overdid it on efficiency, and now I need resilience. And part of this resilience is localizing some of my supply chain. Then ask this next question before you jump, does that mean globalization is going down? Does that mean you're going to abandon countries? And they say, no, we're going to move towards the model in China for China. So globalization will continue, but will take another form. And this is, I think, the key issue, is that if we can understand that there's this wave coming that's going to be very hard to stop because it's going to be powered by companies, governments, and individuals who feel alienated and marginalized because of how unequal the shock is, that we can use it in a way that allows for all the positive externalities and the multipliers that everybody's been talking about. But
Dr. Larian, thank you. Let's certainly hope so. Let's ask the great skeptic of globalization, Professor Danny Roderick, what he thinks. You've been calling out against globalization. Now we seem to be in deglobalization mode. Are you any more optimistic that the left behind are going to be taken into account?
Well, I'm not a skeptic of globalization. I'm a skeptic of the globalization we've had, and I think it's important to realize that we can have very different types of globalization, and I hope that we will have a better globalization in the future. And just to underscore what I mean, imagine a globalization where we had at the center institutions like the UN, the WHO, international climate agreements, UNESCO, UNICEF, the ILO, instead of the organizations that we've actually had, the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank. That would be a very different type of globalization that would reflect many different priorities. I mean, there's a paradox here. I mean, here we are, all of us.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor. You're saying a different kind of globalization, which isn't all about the economic machine.
It's not driven by corporations and international banks, which is essentially the groups and interests that have designed the agenda. And I think so. Globalization is always a system of rules, and the question is always who writes the rules. And I think we need a different set of actors writing the rules. I was just going to mention the paradox that we are all sort of discussing under the auspices of the United Nations, the most august institution in the world, and we largely are agreeing. But we all sound like little schoolboys complaining about the headmaster, the principal, who is actually somewhere else. All the real decisions are actually being taken someplace else, and not under this particular hood. And I think that just tells us something. So I think we, in terms of deglobalization, I mean, this has already been happening. I think ever since the global financial crisis, global value chains have stopped growing. China is now is much less export oriented than it was. Its export to GDP ratio has fallen from around 36% to about 18% of the economy. That's sort of bringing it back to where it was at the beginning of the 2000s when the export push took place. So there are already ongoing trends. So I think COVID will certainly reinforce those trends, the kind of regionalization trends that Mohamed also mentioned. But I think, we need to have a debate not about, globalization versus deglobalization, but sort of getting the right issues on the agenda and really dealing with the true global public goods like fighting climate change, addressing social inclusion, sort of vaccines, and fighting global public bads like global tax havens. And I think that's, I hope this time we can win the peace.
Professor Roderick, thank you very much. Maybe we'll change the definition of globalization in the process. So regionalization of trade, something that's been popping up in the last few interventions. I'm going to ask Vera Songwe about that. We've seen a big new regional trade agreement in Asia. There's a big one in Africa about to be unveiled next year, I believe. It was put off a bit because of the pandemic, the African Continent Free Trade Area. Do you think it'll be a game changer, Vera?
Yes, I think so. I think it is already a game changer for three reasons, and a lot of the conversation that we've been having before is pointing to that. My sense is globalization will continue, but it will be a globalization that is sitting on a regional agenda. And that is where we're going. And I think what we will begin to see is, we saw it when COVID hit, the developed world and in particular Europe and then Asia closed their borders to the trading of pharmaceutical goods. And that immediately had a knee-jerk reaction where Africa said, but we need these things, and so how can we produce them ourselves? And so there was a big sort of push to see whether, and that's why I think when we talk about the resilience of the continent, one of the reasons we didn't hear Africa looking for test kits is because we built an African medical supplies platform. Immediately, within 2 months, we stood up an African medical supplies platform. We were able to pull together commodities, put them on the platform and make them readily accessible. This happened at the regional level in response to a regional reaction from Europe and a regional reaction from East Asia. And I think immediately East Asia then came back to Africa and said, but we want to be on your platform. And we said, but you closed your markets. And then they said, no, we can sort of redo this in a different way. And then the same thing happened with Europe. And I think that what Africa is doing is realizing that as a regional entity, it has a slightly more better space on the table to have these negotiations. I want to just go back a little bit to what is the welfare function that we will maximize when we come out of this crisis. And I think as we talk about even the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, this is, and I've said it so many times, it is sort of the big sort of infrastructure investment blueprint for the continent. Yes, it's about trade, but really when we talk about trade, we're talking about the enablers. We're talking about the energy that's going to be needed for infrastructure. We're talking about the roads and the railways and the telecommunications and the ICT. That is, the African Medical Supplies Platform is an IT-powered platform. And so there's a huge, I think, infrastructure ask there, which needs to then say, how do we then interface that infrastructure ask with the private sector that comes in a green and sort of more sustainable, more resilient fashion. And my sense is, as we have these conversations, and let's remember before the crisis, even though I always used to think that was not the right way of putting that conversation, everybody used to start their conversations with, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa, which we should have been talking about GDP per capita, not just about growth. But then, 3 months later, we're saying, but these economies were all bad. We can't have it both ways. These economies were growing, they were investing, they were doing the right things. And I think what we need to be able to do is to say, coming out of this crisis with the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is looking at regional supply chains, we are not saying we will not trade with the rest of the world, but we're saying we will build value. We will build more value internally on the continent. We will create supply chains within the continent so that by the time we export, we're actually exporting something close to a finished good something with a lot more R&D content, something with a lot more innovation content, so that we're creating more value. And that is the point of the
success. I certainly hope it works out that way. Something we haven't heard so far, ladies and gentlemen, is anyone talking very much about the WTO? We're talking about the rebirthing of the global economy. Do we need the rebirthing of the WTO? Let's ask Professor Chan his views on that. Professor Chan?
Thank you. Yes, today we heard that the U.S. President-elect Joe Biden is going to appoint the first ever woman to the post of Treasury Secretary. Now, very interestingly, that the very first holder of that post, Alexander Hamilton, advanced this idea known as infant industry promotion, namely the idea that the governments of economically backward nations need to provide protection and nurturing so that their young producers can develop productive capabilities that in the way that Ms. Songwe was describing, and eventually compete in the world economy on equal terms with more advanced producers from the richer countries. Now, this is an idea that has often been misunderstood as the recommendation for indiscriminate protectionism. It is not. It basically recommends that the richest countries engage in almost free trade, while as the countries that become poorer and poorer, they are given more leeway in terms of using interventionist measures like the tariffs, subsidies, and regulations of foreign direct investment. And I think this principle is faintly recognized in the WTO in the form of the so-called special and differential treatment, although I think the word special needs to be dropped. It's a bit like calling the wheelchair lifts for disabled people special treatment. It's just a differential treatment for people with differential abilities. And I think that principle needs to be reasserted in the WTO, because why has the WTO been deadlocked? Because developing countries recognize and demand that they are allowed to use policies and institutions that are more suited to their level of development and needs in the same way that, for example, like a more flexible intellectual property rights system. And I think this is the timing to reset that, so that this trading regime can serve the needs of developing countries better.
Okay, Professor Chung, thank you very much. You put that point very clearly. The WTO has been deadlocked. Don't we know that? It needs reform. And perhaps we need to take into account the special needs of developing countries rather more honestly going forwards. I've just been told by the producers that we're running a bit late, so I'm going to ask our final two speakers to speak succinctly. Something we have not heard a great deal about so far is austerity. Public expenditure is soaring. We've heard that perhaps economic efficiency is no longer the great god to be worshipped. Is austerity also part of history? Let's ask Vusi Sibeko. What do you reckon, Vusi?
Unfortunately, austerity is still on the table. New research shows that since the pandemic was declared in March, 76 out of the 91 IMF loans, 84% negotiated with 81 countries push for austerity. And countries which are receiving these loans have also been encouraged to roll back on social protections since the beginning of the pandemic. And here specifically talking about Ecuador, where they've been told to cut back on healthcare expenditure despite it being a health pandemic. But I think critically it's to realize that across a number of countries, austerity has led to rising unemployment, falling incomes, and increased inequality, and in fact has exacerbated the realities of women. And I think this has been raised already, this idea of fiscal solidarity. I think the United Nations and globally, we have to take a strong stand against austerity and regressive taxation, and to encourage governments to do what it takes to rebirth this new global economy.
Sibeko, it's important that we don't ditch austerity in the rich world only to keep ramming it down the throats of developing countries. isn't it? So we haven't heard from Yanis Varoufakis, and I thought I'd keep him to the end of this bit of the discussion, because we're asking you for big, bold ideas, and I'm sure he's going to give us something in that department. Yanis Varoufakis.
Well, thank you very much, Nisha, for your trust. Look, it will take a lot more than vaccines in order to cure the two main diseases that constantly threaten humanity. On the one hand, is climate change, and as Paul Krugman said, we need investment, serious investment, especially in the global south, and the natural tendency of global capitalism to create a chasm between surplus countries and deficit countries. So why not think of ways of killing two diseases with one stone? Right, I'm not going to say anything about birds. Imagine that we were to revisit the IMF and have the following agreement at the level of the International Monetary Fund. Use the SDRs or some kind of revamped mechanism of the SDRs version of this international currency accounting unit, and agree that all international payments, including international trade and capital flows, are denominated in this common currency unit. SDRs, let's call it the cosmos, let's call it whatever. And imagine that we all agree that deficits and surpluses are charged a percentage, a levy, symmetrically. And that, those cosmos units or SDRs go into a common global equity, green equity fund from which to fund green investments, especially in the developing world. That way, we will be simultaneously bringing down the deficits and surpluses, which during the upturn, the periods of global economic growth, are creating tensions, and then during the periods of crisis, are creating huge inequalities and asymmetric adjustment, and therefore debt crisis in the third world, in the developing countries. So we bring these imbalances down, and in the process, creating funding for green investment globally, and especially in the global south. That is, by the way, this is not an original thought. John Maynard Keynes proposed a version of it, the International Clearing Union in 1944 at Bretton Woods. It was rejected. It's time to revive that kind of thinking in order to combine our tools and instruments against a variety of threats to humanity.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure I understood every last wrinkle of what you said, but it certainly sounded bold and new Bretton Woods, as it were. I'm going to hand to the Deputy Secretary General in a minute to give us her convening thoughts, her concluding thoughts, I should say. I wonder what she's made of our conversation, and I hope she feels that we have come up with more than just a few tidbits, but really actionable suggestions, both for the immediate, for the short term, and for the longer term rebirthing of the global economy. Let me hand over to Her Excellency Amina Mohammed now.
Thank you, Nisha. You just got a $1,000 fine for the Excellency. Thank you so much to everyone. This has been a really stimulating discussion, and I wouldn't be able to do justice to try to harvest all that we've heard today, except to say that much of it is in the direction of travel that the SG has called for since March, April this year, when it was really apparent that the global response was not forthcoming at the scale and with the urgency that it was required, and we're still hearing much about that. My humble reflections. First, that I think, the pause that COVID put on all of us across the globe, I think has been a really important opportunity to try to, first of all, reflect that much of what we're speaking about today wasn't new. Before COVID, there was a looming debt crisis, there was inequality. All the things that you speak about, quite frankly, emerging and developing countries have been dealing with it for a long time. But it was a leveler to show us that these issues are global in nature. And it just appears that we have more capacity in some parts of the world than we do elsewhere. But it is a human crisis, and I think today of an unprecedented scale, where we're seeing billionaires and their wealth increasing exponentially, while we're risking hundreds of millions of people going back into poverty, just what we had succeeded with in the last few years. And, you know, at the beginning of this year, talking about the decade of action and how we could speed up fight facing the development goals. I think that, you know, what we've been hearing today, SG has opened up the space to remind, I think, those that take the powers that should be individually and collectively responding to this crisis, that it's not enough. And we are still very far from where we need to be coming to the end of 2020. So the reality check has been that this is going to take a lot longer for many to recover from. And that, I think, we heard very clearly from his opening. And I think Christine Lagarde talked about hope, risk, the journey ahead. We heard about the reality of the tension between the debtors and the creditors. I mean, these are debtors, these are real live governments with millions of people at hand who have to have some sort of a response within their stimulus packages, and quite frankly, have not had that. So any African leader you talk to today, he's almost not willing to come out and have a conversation about this because they've talked themselves dry in spite of all the efforts that have been made. So the new sort of narrative and thinking, flipping that orthodoxy, is needed more than ever. And when we talk about inequality, and I keep hearing everyone talk about inequality, no one actually juxtaposing that to the instabilities it's going to cause in many of these countries. At the root of this, whether it is Mali's transition or Sudan or an election in Guinea, the fact is that this inequality is causing instabilities, and the conflict that we're seeing today in all its varying forms is global and very expensive and difficult to get back around from. So too is the fracturing of many governance systems, and this is across the world. This is not just about developing countries, the developed countries and governance issues. When we speak about tax, we speak about the illicit flows. I mean, so many things that there are two sides to that story, and we are still not facing that head on. So I think there is, you know, a big conversation on how we need to move forward with proposals that have massive counter-cyclical stimulus measures, universal social protection floors, aligning our recovery policies and packages with the SDGs and the climate agenda, and perhaps attaching conditions to stimulus and debt relief, committing to zero emissions. All these things are not new, and we've been speaking about them more, I think, with more conviction over the last few months. So a lot of work to do to ensure that perhaps systems are repurposed, fit for the challenges today for tomorrow. So that's our response. What we do today, what we do in these stimulus packages, how we respond to supporting these emerging countries will reflect on the tomorrow. So urgency, scale, and the need in the coming months, well, certainly in the past few months, whatever it is that we've attempted to do is still very much a work in progress for that. Rebirthing our global economy to deliver, hopefully, global dividends for sustainable development, because we keep speaking about global as though we're all in it. And maybe we do fit in those words, but I'm very sure that many have dropped out the bottom. And we really need to see what we do up here, the discussions that we have here. We really need to feel that they are connecting and rooting and having impact at the local level in countries. We do need to be bold and courageous in our leadership everywhere, and it's at different levels. It's not just in the public sector, it is in the private sector who've become incredibly comfortable with the status quo. Lots of uncharted territory. We've heard that we should be learning from history. We're not. The economic policy need much more work to emerge stronger. Absolutely right. There's a huge fragmentation in policy. Having a consensus on the implications of inaction across the major players, both public and private. We don't have a consensus on the implications of inaction because those implications, many feel, may not be the case, that everything will be all right on the night. And so we're talking past each other for that. The vaccine is a case in point. It's such a small amount of money, $28 billion, for goodness sake, against what we're speaking about of countries' default, of the billions that will go back into poverty, of the jobs that will be lost, of what we've heard Christine say will take a lot longer for us to get back. So why does, it seems like it's a no-brainer, but perhaps that's what we're talking about right now, is having men and women at the table really having a good conversation about this, because that's not coming across to decision makers. Leveling the playing field, I mean, Vera has brought up a number of issues that, you really feel perhaps the inequality is in the access to the markets and the rules of the game. And if you say you've got good fundamentals and someone has much poorer but is getting a better deal, what incentive is there for anyone to think that globalization is going to work for them and that we will also not turn inwards or see countries turn inwards in the developing world? And we are seeing, and we're encouraging, we're engaging countries in the South, developing countries, to say, you've got the opportunity now, it's a much less than the expense of retrofitting your economies, to do the green transition, because you're not the responsible for the emissions. But that needs investment. It doesn't need charity. It needs a partnership that allows those investments to be made. So I would say that, you know, we still haven't seen an appetite at the level where decision-making and leadership matters to face what we need to do in the coming weeks and months. We've seen 9-10 months go by, and it really has been incremental. Someone's waiting for something to happen that's not going to happen, and we need to take those actions. And much of the discussions we've heard in these 3 roundtables have been, I think, reassuring to the United Nations that that space of convening that we have needs to be done a little bit more aggressively and purposefully and more concretely to make people feel uncomfortable, because that's what we need to be to make the changes we need. Your reflections and the steer that you've given us will feed into a much more structured response to leaders, and I hope concrete actions that are needed for the global response and recovery. There are many moving parts, clear from your discussions, and maybe the globalization 2.0 needs to be more inclusive. We need to define that inclusive, but the outcomes need not to leave anyone behind. And it's a very serious, you know, 3 letters, LNB. It's a new, you know, UN loves acronyms, but it's really important. It will change perhaps the way multilateralism is understood, that it is better networked. It's not just about countries defining that and us depending on it with a false bottom. I would say finally that the emphasis on young people, the gender dimension, vulnerabilities, these are actually the huge numbers that we have. And they will be the make or break of the world that we say we want. And I think they have had very little emphasis in the discussions that we've had. And in the coming weeks and months, we need to engage them so that perhaps we can then stimulate the appetite for being uncomfortable enough to act responsibly. I think it's really important that we do that. We're welcoming the new US leadership. We are welcoming the new leadership of the G20. We're also committing to that convening space that the UN has, and we're listening to different voices on how they think we could best do that, and building on what the SG has done with Jamaica and Canada. But I would also say that the new partners on the block and leadership is going to come from our new emerging countries, and it will be regional, and it will be stronger. I've just come out of a 5-country visit in West Africa. I don't think they're waiting any longer. It may take them longer to get to where they need to get to, but they're not waiting. And I don't think it's in our interest that we don't find spaces to make sure that we aren't engaged in the path to what everyone believes should be a more peaceful and prosperous world, and doable. It's the only time in the world that we've had this number of young people, these number of tools that we can experiment with. We can, as Christine said, let's be given the space to make a mistake and fail and get back up again and do it. And one that just talks about youth, cities where our populations will be by 2050, and the digital technology of our world, which will bring us closer together, hopefully for good. But this has been a really special day for me. I think that what we've heard from you has underscored all the work that we've done, that there's much more to do, but there is a lot more hope than there are, challenges that we cannot overcome. So thank you, Nisha, for keeping us all engaged. And thank you to each and every one of you for participating. And I hope that this will not be the end of the conversation as we come back to you individually and collectively. Thank you.
It surely won't. Thank you so much, Amina Mohammed, and a huge thank you to all our eminent economists for giving us so much of their time, their wisdom, their experience, and their guidance. Thank you to all of you for watching our webcast, wherever you may be. I'm going to give the final word to somebody out there who posts this on social media. I like that several participants called for a new type of globalization, whether that be deglobalization, local globalization, or a more regional globalization. one that prioritizes global public goods over a purely economic agenda. Now is the time to capitalize on this moment. Hear, hear. I'm Nisha Pillay. It's been my pleasure to be your moderator today. Until the next time, goodbye.